Now, the social and economic crisis accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened South Africa's fiscal crisis. The country's public finances remain overextended year on year, with economists warning that South Africa will soon reach a tipping point. We're now joined by Mohale. He's the chairperson of the Bidvest Group Limited. Good evening, Mr. Mohale, and thank you so much for your time. Perhaps your own impressions of the finance minister's speech today and what the key takeaways were for you.
In fact, if anything, it demonstrates beyond any shadow of doubt, my dear sister, that we are in a perilous position, all of it self-made, self-inflicted, self-harm, because we shouldn't be where we are today. So I think what the Minister of Finance has done is to paint this big picture without even glossing over it. In fact, when one looks at the finances, they're actually deteriorating, because we have now moved from having a national debt of 3 trillion, we're almost on 4 trillion, forecast to go to 5.2 trillion. Our borrowing was at 2.1 billion per day. It's now going to increase. Debt to GDP ratio was sitting at 93%. If you exclude guarantees to state-owned enterprises, if we include those 110%, we don't have the ability to pay. And this was demonstrated by how government struggled to come to the party with their portion of getting us into the COVAX program for ensuring that we roll out the vaccines. When you look at our debt servicing costs will increase from 20 billion a day, and it is increasing. Of what Edward Kieswetter collects from South African Revenue Services, 70% of it actually goes to 3 buckets: public sector wage bill, social security, and debt. Our deficit was 4%, now it's 16%. Our GDP growth for this year is minus 7.2%, forecast to grow by 3.3% positive next year. But we are still going to reach our pre-COVID levels only in 2024. Tax revenues down minus 18%, improving tax collection ahead of budget, but our exports are decreasing. Lastly, of course, our unemployment rate, yesterday we saw the figures, they're actually quite frightening, because the elements that were present during the Arab Spring are here and immediate with us. Youth unemployment approaching 60%. We are talking about 32.5% unemployment rate. But this is the narrow ILO definition. When you expand it, it's 40%. I mean, it is absolutely unsustainable. Lastly, my dear sister, I think what the Minister of Finance was trying to do was to put into effect what the president has promised in his State of the Nation address, with the foremost overriding priorities. One being, of course, defeat the coronavirus pandemic. Number 2, accelerate our economic recovery. Number 3, implement our economic reforms that we've been talking about for the last 10 years to achieve 2 things: to create sustainable jobs and drive this notion of an inclusive growth. And then lastly, of course, to fight corruption and strengthen the state. I think if we're to achieve only 2 out of those 4, we will send a strategic message that says South Africa is addressing some of the things that are holding us back. But until and unless we demonstrate this through a reduced public sector wage bill, I think we will really be really speaking to ourselves, not to analysts, and not to investors. For us as business, we have always been consistent, my dear sister, that one, in exactly the same way that the share price is driven by rumor and speculation, we need to address the lowest levels of confidence, of trust and hope. And you do that by sending 3 top state capture miscreants to jail. You ensure that you secure vaccines as a matter of life and death, because the vaccine rollout program, it's actually a race. The country that will say we have reached herd immunity first is the country that is going to reap this pent-up tourism demand. Thirdly, we said we must reduce the total government debt. We must fix our more than 740 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies and increase our infrastructure spend. The Minister of Finance was really very categorical, very explicit about the programs. And then lastly, We've been talking again for 10 years about the spectrum auction and digital migration. 5 ministers later, we have lost faith. We have been underwhelming about talking about it. At this rate, our SACU partners, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini, will be on 6G, will still be languishing at 4G. Back to you, Sheikh.
Mr. Mohali, even just on those points that you've highlighted that, you know, are key, at least in terms of reforms that you believe would be an indication that the country is going in the right direction. We didn't get any specific details from the minister's speech today. And, you know, when one looks at the state of the country, of course, some of the things that the minister said are obvious. You know, South Africans don't need to be told about how dire a situation we're in. We're living it every single day. One wants to get a sense of direction. One wants to get a sense of how the situation is going to be turned around. Do you believe that that is what the finance minister has done for today, that he's given South Africans clear indications of how in the next year, at the very least, we're going to be able to turn our fortunes around?
In fact, I think you have hit the nail on the head. If I start only with the first priority to demonstrate that we could have gotten much more comprehensive details, and you look at just our BRICS counterpart in terms of vaccine doses already administered. On the 27th of January, Brazil was already on 579,000. Russia was on 800,000. India on 2 million. China on 15 million already. The government owns since 2003 a stake in BioVac, a biopharmaceutical company based in Cape Town. When I grew up, Lennon's was owned by government, the modern day Aspen Pharmaceuticals. So the president sets us a herd immunity target of 67%. This is 40 million South Africans out of 60. Depending on the choice of the vaccine, if it's double dose, that's 80 million doses. We are at the moment, everything that we have procured and scheduled to be delivered, 1.6 million doses short. That's 100,000 per day. In a week, we haven't even reached 100,000. The cost is 20 billion, of course, depending on the type, on the foreign exchange, the cargo insurance, on the dose, whether it's imported or it's made locally. If you look at the other business partners and social partners that could help, 2018, only 16.4% of the population of South Africa belong to medical aid. The medical schemes in total have a total maximum liability of 7 billion. That's 2% of all premiums. So if you say to the mines, vaccinate your own people, and you say so to agriculture, and you say so to financial services, they can do this within a month. And I think we need to take it with that risk that it is indeed intended. South Africa has always been helped by global events. At the moment, the people that are exporting have benefited from both the increased dollar terms, commodity prices, but also by the pent-up demand. Some of the logistics and the supply chain that we normally get when the ships go to US of A, offload, and then come to Africa, didn't even do that because they were stuck in the US of A. When the demand came up, they offloaded there. They didn't even have come to Africa. They went straight to reload in China, which says, actually, in global terms, we are a spit in the bucket, less than 1% of the global turnover, until and unless we send a message that says we are open for business, we will never be able to take ourselves seriously. And as a result, the investors and the analysts will never be able to take us seriously. When you look at how we've been helped, iron ore prices went up 53%, gold 48%. When you look at coal, it probably went up 28%, and 25% other commodities. All of this made sure that South African Revenue Services track ahead of their own budget. We were estimating 313 billion shortfall. We revised that to between 240 to 280 billion. Now we are talking about probably less than 200 billion a shortfall because we are doing so well. But I think our needs are 1,001, and yet our means, ability to pay, is severely constrained. So we have to address things like the public sector wage bill. We have to go back and say, what are the 3, 4 things, like the president has led the way, not the 30 things that needs to be done. And then lastly, I think we need to make the NDP 2030 our overriding economic vision, because without that strategy, that correctly diagnoses the 9 things that we must do, I think we'll still be sucking the hind teeth. Back to you, Shannon.
Bonang Mohale, let's leave it there for tonight. He's the chairman of the Bidvest Group Limited. Thanks for your time.